1688, a merchant ship leaves London harbor for the Caribbean. It carries supplies, trade goods, and something unusual, a piece of paper, a contract signed by the King of England himself. The contract says this ship has permission to attack, plunder, and destroy any Spanish vessel it encounters. Keep the treasure, just give the king his cut. This wasn't piracy, this was business, legal business, sanctioned by the crown, and it was making people extraordinarily rich. The contract was called a Letter of Marque. The captains who held them were called privateers, and they were creating something that would eventually become Wall Street. This is the story of how pirates invented modern finance, how robbery became investment, how criminals became capitalists. What did pirates create that we still use today? Let's start with the problem that made all of this necessary. The 1500s. Spain controlled the New World completely. They had conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico, destroyed the Inca civilization in Peru, dominated every Caribbean island. And most importantly, they controlled the gold. Mountains of gold and rivers of silver flowing from the Americas back to Spain in massive treasure fleets. Every single year, dozens of enormous galleons loaded with silver bars, gold coins, emeralds, and pearls sailed across the Atlantic Ocean back to the port of Seville. This flood of New World wealth made Spain the richest nation in Europe, and every other nation wanted a piece desperately. But Spain had a complete monopoly enforced by violence. If you weren't Spanish, you couldn't trade in the New World. If you tried, Spanish warships hunted you down, captured your ships, imprisoned your crews, or turned you over to the Inquisition. Torture, execution, public display of bodies. Spain didn't negotiate. They controlled the Americas and intended to keep it that way forever. So how did England break this monopoly? England, France, and the Netherlands had a serious problem. They desperately wanted access to American wealth but couldn't fight Spain directly. Spain's military was too powerful. The Spanish tercios were the most feared infantry in Europe. The Spanish Armada dominated the seas. A direct war would be phenomenally expensive and probably unwinnable. So they found another way, a brilliant way. They privatized the war. They turned piracy into official government policy and made robbery completely legal through paperwork. How do you make piracy legal? The mechanism was called the Letter of Marque, an official government document that authorized a privately owned ship to attack enemy vessels, capture their cargo, sink their ships, and keep most of the profit. In exchange, the government received a percentage, usually between 10 and 20%. It was genius from a government perspective. The government got to wage economic warfare against Spain without paying for an expensive Royal Navy. Private investors risked their own money. Captains and crews did the fighting and dying, and the crown just collected its comfortable percentage. Here's how it worked in practice. A wealthy merchant or group of investors would approach the Admiralty Court with a detailed proposal. We want to sail to the Caribbean, attack Spanish shipping, and bring back treasure. The government would carefully evaluate the proposal. Do these investors have suitable ships, experienced captains? Can they actually succeed? If approved, they issued the Letter of Marque. This legal document named the ship, the captain, the investors, and the terms very clearly. You are authorized to attack vessels belonging to Spain. Any treasure you capture belongs to you, just pay the crown its agreed percentage. And here's the critical part. If you were captured by the Spanish, you were not legally classified as a pirate. You were a prisoner of war protected by international law. This distinction mattered enormously. Pirates were hanged immediately with no trial and their bodies displayed in cages as warnings. But prisoners of war could be ransomed or exchanged. The Letter of Marque was literally the difference between execution and survival. But it was more than just legal protection, it was something bigger. The Letter of Marque was fundamentally a financial instrument, because these expeditions were phenomenally expensive. A suitable warship cost thousands of pounds to purchase. Outfitting it with cannons, gunpowder, supplies, and paying crew wages could cost another 10,000 pounds. That's millions in today's money. Most captains didn't have that kind of capital, so they found investors, rich merchants, wealthy nobles, sometimes even royalty. Queen Elizabeth I of England personally invested crown funds in multiple privateering expeditions. These investors bought shares in the voyage. You invest £1,000, you own 10% of the venture. If the voyage succeeds and returns with treasure, you receive 10% of the profit. If the voyage fails and the ship is lost, you lose your entire investment. It was pure venture capital. Extraordinarily high risk, but also extraordinarily high potential reward. Just how much treasure could one captured ship be worth? A single Spanish treasure galleon could be carrying 500,000 pounds worth of silver. That's over $100 million in today's currency. Plus chests of gold coins, emeralds the size of eggs, and thousands of pearls. When split among the investors, the crew, and the crown, everyone involved could become spectacularly wealthy. And successful investors would immediately reinvest their profits, fund more expeditions, build entire fleets, and become some of the wealthiest men in England. The most famous and successful privateer in history was Francis Drake. He was the son of a poor tenant farmer who started his maritime career as a slave trader. In 1568, Spanish warships destroyed most of his fleet in a surprise attack. Drake barely escaped with his life and gained a burning, lifelong hatred of Spain. He switched from slave trading to privateering and became the most successful pirate who ever lived. In 1577, Drake left Plymouth, England with 5 ships and 164 men. The expedition was funded by a syndicate of wealthy investors including Queen Elizabeth herself, who invested £1,000 of crown money. Drake's mission was ambitious: sail around the entire world, attack Spanish colonies and shipping wherever he found them, and bring back as much treasure as the ships could carry. Drake sailed down the coast of Africa, crossed the Atlantic, navigated through the treacherous Strait of Magellan, and entered the Pacific Ocean. Then he began systematically raiding the western coast of Spanish America. The Spanish were completely unprepared because all their military defenses and warships faced the Atlantic Ocean where they expected attacks. Drake was attacking from an impossible direction. And then he found the ultimate prize. March 1, 1579. Off the coast of Ecuador, Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, encountered the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. The Spanish called her the Cacafugo. She was the single richest treasure ship sailing the Pacific route between Peru and Panama. She was traveling alone, completely unescorted, because the Spanish believed the Pacific was safe. Drake pursued her for several days, finally caught her, and fired a warning shot. When the Spanish captain refused to surrender, Drake fired a devastating broadside. The merchant crew quickly surrendered to avoid further bloodshed. Drake's men boarded the ship and opened the cargo holds. They found 80 pounds of solid gold, 26 tons of pure silver, 13 large chests overflowing with silver coins, multiple chests of precious emeralds, and thousands of pearls. It was the richest maritime prize ever captured by an English ship. Drake's crew spent 6 full days just transferring all the treasure because there was so much they could barely carry it. Drake continued north, claimed the California coast for England, then made the bold decision to cross the entire Pacific Ocean rather than risk returning through Spanish-controlled waters. He visited the Spice Islands, loaded valuable cloves, sailed across the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and finally returned to Plymouth in September 1580. The voyage had taken 3 full years. 5 ships had departed England. Only one returned. But that single ship carried treasure worth £600,000. That's over $150 million today. How rich did this make the investors? The investors were absolutely thrilled. They had collectively invested about £5,000 to fund the original expedition. They received back roughly 47 times their investment, a return of 4,700% in 3 years. Queen Elizabeth's personal share was £300,000, which was enough to completely pay off England's entire accumulated national debt in one payment. Drake was knighted by the Queen herself, became a celebrated national hero, and privateering officially became England's primary weapon against Spanish power. But this wasn't just about individuals getting rich. This was strategic economic warfare. Every Spanish ship that privateers captured was silver that never reached Spain's treasury. Every colonial town that was raided was production capacity destroyed forever. Every treasure fleet that was delayed or scattered meant interest payments Spain couldn't make on their massive debts to Italian and German banking houses. And Spain desperately needed that American silver because they were funding enormous military operations all across Europe. Fighting in the Netherlands, occupying Italy, intervening in Germany and France. All of this required constant flows of money, and virtually all of that money came from American silver mines. If you could cut off or significantly reduce that critical silver flow, Spain couldn't pay its armies of professional soldiers who would mutiny without wages. Spain couldn't service its debts. The entire Spanish military machine would grind to a halt, not from battlefield defeat but from simple bankruptcy. By 1600, after just 30 years of intensive English and Dutch privateering, Spanish treasure fleets were losing between 20 and 30% of their ships every single year. Billions of silver coins never reached Spain. The Spanish economy was steadily bleeding wealth. King Philip II defaulted on Spain's sovereign debt 4 separate times during his reign, not because Spain was poor, but because the wealth was being intercepted before it arrived. But how did funding piracy create modern capitalism? Now here's where the real innovation happened. The fundamental problem with privateering as an investment was the extraordinary, almost unbearable risk. Outcomes were wildly unpredictable. Some voyages succeeded spectacularly and returned 4,000% profits. Other voyages failed completely with total loss of all invested capital. Investors had no reliable way to predict which outcome any particular voyage would produce. So investors did something remarkably clever that would change finance forever. They spread the risk. Instead of putting all their capital into one voyage, they deliberately invested smaller amounts in multiple different expeditions simultaneously. You take £10,000 and put 1,000 into 10 completely different voyages with different captains and different routes. If 2 expeditions succeed spectacularly, 4 break even, and 4 fail completely, you still make substantial profit overall because the big winners more than cover the losers. This is portfolio diversification, the absolute foundation of modern investment strategy. Privateering investors invented this concept out of pure necessity and survival instinct. But portfolio diversification required something that didn't exist yet. Portfolio diversification required infrastructure, required organization, required a liquid market where investors could efficiently buy and sell shares in various expeditions, and that's exactly what developed organically in London coffeehouses. Lloyd's Coffee House, the Jamaica Coffee House, the Virginia Coffee House. These establishments weren't just places to drink imported coffee. They functioned as sophisticated financial centers and early stock markets. Investors would gather there every business day. Wealthy merchants, ship captains, retired naval officers, professional financiers. They would discuss ongoing voyages, share the latest news and rumors, and actively trade shares. The captain would walk in and announce he was planning a voyage to raid the Spanish Main. He had obtained a letter of marque from the Admiralty. He needed funding. Investors would bid on shares right there. £100 for 5% ownership. £500 for 20%. Deals were made with handshakes and recorded in ledgers kept by the coffeehouse owners. And then something revolutionary happened to those shares. The shares themselves became tradable financial instruments. You initially bought a 10% share in Drake's 3-year voyage, but halfway through the expedition you suddenly need money urgently. So you go to the Jamaica Coffee House, find another investor interested in buying your share and sell it, maybe at a profit if rumors suggest the voyage is going well, or at a loss if reports indicate problems. A genuine secondary market developed where people were actively buying and selling ownership stakes in voyages that were still ongoing, that wouldn't return for years. This was pure financial speculation. By 1650, thousands of investors were trading privateer shares daily in London coffeehouses, and the trading volume was enormous. In 1698, the informal coffeehouse system simply wasn't sufficient anymore. Too chaotic, deals were contested, records were incomplete. Fraud was increasingly common, so investors created something revolutionary. They founded the London Stock Exchange. It started as the New Jonathan's Coffee House but functioned from the beginning as a formal institution where shares could be traded officially, deals recorded permanently, prices posted publicly, and regulations began to develop. It started with privateering shares, then expanded to shares in the great trading companies. The East India Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Royal African Company. All of these were funded using the exact same mechanisms developed for privateer financing. Private investors pooling capital, buying tradable shares, spreading risk, hopping for enormous returns, and the stock market was born directly from piracy. But who were these men creating the stock market? The men who created the London Stock Exchange were the exact same men who had been funding privateers for decades. They had learned through funding piracy all the fundamental techniques of modern finance: how to pool capital from multiple investors, how to spread risk across ventures, how to trade shares in secondary markets, how to value uncertain outcomes, how to speculate, how to manage portfolios. The financial instruments of Wall Street today, stocks, bonds, speculation, portfolio diversification, secondary markets, all came directly from the privateer financing system. The buccaneers weren't just stealing Spanish gold. They were inventing modern capitalism. The investors weren't just getting rich, they were creating the entire modern financial system. But by 1700, the age of privateers was ending. By 1700, Spain was much weaker. England, France, and the Netherlands had built powerful royal navies and didn't need privateers anymore. And privateers had become difficult to control. They would attack the wrong ships, continue attacking after wars ended, essentially become pirates. Governments wanted more control and began building professional militaries, stopped issuing letters of marque, and actually started hunting pirates. But the financial system privateering had created remained and grew explosively. By 1800, London was the financial capital of the world, and it all started in those coffeehouses with investors funding pirates. The legacy of privateering is absolutely everywhere in modern finance. Wall Street, stock markets globally, venture capital, investment portfolios, corporate structures, all trace back to the same innovation: pooling private capital, spreading risks, speculating on high-reward ventures. This is what privateers created, and it became modern capitalism. But there's a darker truth we need to face. The line between legitimate investment and outright theft has always been thin. The privateers were legal pirates. Their investors were legal accomplices to robbery and murder. They got rich by funding attacks on ships, theft of cargo, and killing of crews. And all of it was sanctioned by government, celebrated as patriotism, and rewarded with knighthoods and honors. So is modern finance really any different from piracy? Francis Drake was objectively a pirate, a thief, and a murderer. He killed Spanish sailors, stole Spanish treasure, and burned Spanish towns. But he had a letter of marque. He had official government paperwork. So history calls him a hero instead of a criminal. Is modern finance fundamentally different? When a hedge fund deliberately crashes a national currency and destroys the savings of millions, is that really different from a privateer sinking a treasure fleet? When a private equity firm buys a company, strips it for parts, fires thousands of workers, and profits from the destruction, is that different from raiders looting a colonial town? The mechanisms are exactly the same. Pool capital from multiple investors, take calculated risks, extract wealth from targets. The only difference is legality and paperwork. Privateers had letters of marque. Hedge funds have legal corporate structures, but the result is the same. Wealth transferred, often by force or manipulation, usually from the weak to the strong. The story of privateering is the story of capitalism itself. The story of privateering is fundamentally the story of capitalism. It's about turning violence into profit, about making theft legal through paperwork, about creating sophisticated financial instruments to fund robbery. The buccaneers invented the stock market, the investors created Wall Street, and governments legitimized an entire system where profit justifies almost anything as long as you have the right authorization. Today, Wall Street is the center of global finance. Trillions of dollars traded every single day. Stocks, bonds, derivatives, complex financial instruments. But at its core, it's exactly the same as a London coffeehouse in 1650. Investors pooling money, betting on risky ventures, hoping for huge returns. The voyages are different now. The ships are corporations. The treasure is quarterly profit, but the fundamental game hasn't changed. High risk, high reward. And the spirit of the buccaneers lives on. The pirates didn't disappear from history. They went legitimate. They put on expensive suits instead of sailor clothes. They opened beautiful offices on Wall Street, and they called themselves investors, entrepreneurs, and capitalists. But the system they created, the system born from robbery on the high seas, became the foundation of the modern global economy. That's the legacy of the buccaneers. That's how pirates created Wall Street. This is cinematic history tales, where pirates become capitalists, where crime becomes commerce, where the truth gets told about how systems actually work. Subscribe for more stories, because the buccaneers weren't outlaws who somehow became investors. They were investors who started as outlaws, and maybe there was never any real difference at all.